You know, if you were to survey the average American and you were to ask them, do you feel rich or do you feel poor? The vast majority would probably tell you that personally, they feel poor. This has been the case for Americans progressively for the past several decades, and with each passing year, it seems that more and more Americans no longer feel prosperous, but instead they feel like the glory days that they once had were slipping away. And for my entire lifetime, this has essentially defined American politics, at least on the economics issue, where each side is reacting to the same feeling, but they are reacting to it with their own proposed set of solutions aimed at what they think is the cause for this feeling of poverty. On the right, you will see that the feeling is that the reason we feel poor today is because we have lost, for example, our manufacturing jobs to other countries, or because more immigrants have come into our country and have saturated the job market, eliminating jobs for American citizens. Well, on the left, you will see the blame placed differently. It will be placed higher up. It will be placed on the rich, who over the years have accumulated an increasing percentage of the wealth of the nation. However, I would postulate to you that none of these commonly cited underlying reasons for the fact that Americans feel so poor are actually the underlying cause for that feeling. And I'm going to need to do something that you're really not supposed to do, and that is that I am not going to pick a side and therefore probably make everybody on every side mad at me. But that's not my intention. My intention is just to point out the facts. And I can pull examples from both sides to show that the things that they cite as the root cause of their problems are objectively not the root cause. For example, when it comes to the price of American housing and the fact that most Americans feel like they can no longer afford a decent home, it's commonly cited that institutional investors are just buying up all of the U.S. properties and driving up the price of residential real estate, and that's why we can't afford houses. But while this is true, it is only true to a very small degree, because the actual statistic is that institutional investors only own approximately 1% of all U.S. single-family real estate. That will make a small impact, but not enough to take somebody from feeling like they could afford a home to the point of not being able to afford a home. And I could cite examples on the other side as well. It's commonly cited on the right that immigrants and overseas jobs, overseas manufacturing, are the reason that they feel like they can't get a good job. But of course, when we look at the data, that is objectively not true either. Because when we look at actual unemployment rates in the United States, not just individual people's anecdotal experiences of the jobs that they used to be able to get, we find that the unemployment rates have progressively gotten lower and lower and lower over time since around the 1950s, implying a higher employment economy overall, with a few exceptions around financial crises in 2008 and during the 2020 pandemic. What you find when you closely examine these things and others like them is that the issues around which the political battle lines are so commonly drawn very often are not the real issues at all. They're just what people perceive to be the real issues based on their own experiences and what they have been told. But that begs the question, if these aren't the real issues, what is the real reason that most Americans feel so poor? And that's an issue that I want to address throughout this video, and I will give you a very specific reason in just a minute. But before I do that, I want to prove to you something that most Americans don't fully realize, but that they should realize, which is that, objectively speaking, very few Americans are actually poor. And I know that might feel like I am gaslighting you or something like that, so I should start by talking about my own experience when I used to feel poor.
Today's episode was sponsored by Ground News. If you're watching my content, then you know how hard I work to spot bias in narratives that are commonly accepted at face value. In this video, I've already done that several times. However, that can be a difficult job because in 2025, every news source seems to have an angle, and it can be hard to just understand and trust the basic facts. I solved this problem using ground news, which makes it easier to identify and push through bias to get the full story. With ground news, you can see all the different sources covering any given topic, helping you compare and contrast coverage. And helpfully, it even includes AI to help summarize the position of each side for easy access. For example, on today's topic, we see that the United States economy has just shrunk for the first time in over 3 years. The left is blaming Trump and his trade policies, while the right is blaming Biden and his policies, as well as something they're calling corporate doomsday prepping. Importantly, each of these narratives contradict each other, showing that one side is definitely misrepresenting what's going on. That's why it's important to see all sides and whether or not they have any merit before jumping to conclusions. Helpfully, ground news also makes it easy to see who owns the news outlets that are framing things in a certain way, so you can follow the trail of where the money is coming from to fund certain viewpoints. If you like my content, I think you'll like ground news too. Just go to ground.news/Paul to check it out. If you use my link, you can get 40% off the Vantage plan, which is what I use to get unlimited access to all of the features.
For most of my adult life, I have existed in a state of poverty or close to poverty. And I mean that objectively speaking by the actual income ratios that are used to determine poverty, where I was working 50 to 60 hours a week trying to build businesses that kept failing. And on average, I was earning an annual income of between $25,000 and $30,000 US dollars for about half of my adult life. And I was doing this in the state of California, one of the most expensive states in the union. And I was doing it without any government benefits. I probably should have applied for government benefits, but I never did. So I always felt very poor, and I understand exactly how the average American feels. In fact, I might understand it more than most Americans, because most Americans make a whole lot more money than that. And yet, when I look back at this period of my life, I realize that while I felt poor, objectively, I was quite wealthy. I lived in a home where I never missed my rent payment, and it was hard to find, but I did find it. I always had access to air conditioning and heat, even if I sometimes had to ration that a little bit and not use it all the time. I always had access to food. I never missed a meal. I always had access to hot water. I always had access to a car that I could use to drive me anywhere I wanted, even if I couldn't go to certain places as often as I might have wanted to. And when I look at my actual living standard, even though I had such a low income in such an expensive state, and I was frustrated about that, I actually never truly lacked for anything. This is an important comparison, and it's an important point to bring up, because if you look at what I have just defined as poverty in the United States, the reality is that for most of the world, they would define that as an unachievable level of wealth. Now, it was during this period of my life where I really wasn't earning much at all, especially compared to what I wanted to be earning, that I learned a very important lesson. Because at this time, I was working construction on some very expensive homes down by the California coast, homes that would cost $2 to $3 million at a minimum, often $4 or $5 million. And as we would drive up to these homes to work, me and the other guys that I worked with, we had a joke. Because we would see the people walking around this extremely wealthy neighborhood who lacked for nothing when compared to any other Americans. And they always just had this depressed scowl on their face. And our joke about these people was, I'm rich and I'm mad about it. What I quickly learned was that these people didn't actually feel wealthy because they lived in a bubble of so many other wealthy people. And when they were analyzing their life and their success and their status and how good they felt about everything, they weren't analyzing from an objective standpoint about what they actually had. but instead they were analyzing from a comparative standpoint and how much they stacked up against the other people that were around them. And I came to realize that whether you feel poor or you feel rich very rarely has anything to do with whether you are actually poor or whether you are actually rich. If you look at videos of families in Africa, you can find videos of families buying their very first bicycle who are ecstatic and they're crying, literally crying tears of joy because of what this rather simple thing is going to unlock for them and empower them to do. And yet, if you look at videos of American families on social media, I am sure you could find somebody crying, not tears of joy, but tears of sadness after purchasing a car if that car doesn't meet their personal standards, even though it might be the second or third or fourth car that their family has. And you see that these two different feelings, one of jubilance in poverty and one of sadness in wealth, really underscores the point that I'm trying to drive at, where we don't measure ourselves objectively. We measure ourselves by what we're surrounded by and what we're used to. This gets to the point of why so many Americans feel so poor and why it's such a big problem, not just for Americans, but also, as we're now seeing, for the rest of the world. And the reason Americans feel so poor today is because compared to their parents and compared to their grandparents, they are. By global standards, the statistics are really clear. In the United States, there is a median income of between $40,000 and $45,000 US dollars every single year. For families, it's around $78,000. And for the rest of the world, that level of median income would put somebody in the top 10% of income brackets. What that means is that if you pick an American at random, there is a 1 in 2 chance, no matter their age, that at this stage of their life, they are better off than 9 in 10 people across the globe. It's actually, technically, it's better off than 85% of all people because you have to factor in for a little bit of purchase price parity. Even if you earn more in the United States, things are a little bit more expensive. But when you factor that in, the average, the median American is better off than 85% of the global population today. But even that is a little bit deceiving because a median income is just a snapshot in time of what the average person earns today. It doesn't account for the growing earning power that that person will earn at the peak of their life. And so actually in the United States, peak median income is around $74,000 US dollars, which means if you look at any individual in the United States, there is a 1 in 2 chance that they will earn at least $74,000 a year at some point in their life. So objectively, just by this standard alone, Americans are better off than 9 in 10 people, but our happiness ratings and other ratings as far as contentment and enjoyment of life do not even close to reflect that. None of this is to say that there is not real poverty in the United States. There is real poverty, and some people in the United States are in absolutely desperate financial positions. But when you compare the ratio of people who is genuinely in a desperate financial position compared to the people who feel psychologically poor and dissatisfied with their level of wealth, you see a massive delta between them. And you realize that being genuinely in a desperate position doesn't have as much to do with whether you feel poor than, again, the comparison that I made earlier, where we compare ourselves to others, and that is how we decide whether we are rich or poor. This is a big problem for the people of the United States because there is a reason we feel this way. And the problem is that this reason cannot be addressed by any simple solutions unless we create utter devastation for the rest of the world. And even then, it's not guaranteed. And I'll explain why. The reason Americans feel so poor today is because objectively, with each subsequent generation, they are getting poorer than their parents were. Which means when they become an adult and they start a family, they cannot, on average, afford the same lifestyle that their parents gave to them as children. This makes them feel in their own lives like they are regressing instead of progressing. And the reason for this regression, which is a genuine regression, even though they are still objectively wealthy, goes all the way back to World War II and the peak period of American prosperity, the generations that followed World War II. The reason the United States became so wealthy after World War II is because at this period of time, nearly every other industrial hub on Earth was completely devastated and destroyed by the war, which left the United States with a virtual monopoly over global manufacturing for a short period of time. This, of course, made everybody incredibly wealthy because of laws of supply and demand, and if you're the only player in town, you will make a lot more money. And this gave Americans an artificial sense of prosperity that they expected would continue forever because they didn't understand the underlying reason that they had become so actually prosperous. Even today in the United States, you will find people who will say as a joke, what we really need with our terrible economy right now is another war. And the reason people say that is because prior to World War II, we had the Great Depression, and after World War II, we had this massive boost in prosperity that seemed like it was never going to end. And people rightly connect the period in time to World War II, but they don't understand that the reason we were so prosperous wasn't because things were going so great, but actually because things were going so terribly for everybody else. When you understand this fact, you realize that whatever the United States did in the period following World War II, they were always going to have a period of prosperity and economic boom, and they were always going to have a period of economic decline as the rest of the world rebuilt, and America now had more competition in global manufacturing. And a lot of the political sentiment that you find in the United States today is sort of a hearkening back to this time when we were the only manufacturing player in town and wanting to get that prosperity back without understanding the fundamentals that created it. It was actually always inevitable that the United States would lose its status as the manufacturing powerhouse as the rest of the world rebuilt. Because as the world was rebuilding, you had literally billions of people who were living at a subsistence level of poverty who wanted any opportunity that they could get. And because of this, these people were willing to accept wages that would be considered offensively low to an American citizen that had been used to being the most prosperous economy on Earth. As Americans, we look at these jobs as if, why would anybody ever work for wages like that? But in the countries where people did work for those wages, it was because they saw it as an incredible opportunity to lift them out of a rural agrarian lifestyle where they could barely, if even, get enough food to feed their families. So this shift was always going to happen, and America was always going to decline to some degree, but it didn't have to be the worst thing in the world. It's not a bad thing, of course, when you understand your own decline in terms that while I am having less wealth that I don't need, less excess wealth, other families in many other corners of the world, because of that phenomenon, are now for the first time being able to fully feed their families on a consistent basis. They're now for the first time being able to ensure that their children don't die at a young age of preventable diseases and things like that. And if most people understood things in those terms, I think actually many Americans would voluntarily take on less wealth so that more people around the world could rise up. However, the problem is that most Americans never really have the opportunity to actually think in this way, because it's never presented to them like this. Instead, because the feeling of regression is so emotionally charged, is so disappointing, is so horrible, even when you are objectively wealthy, because again, we don't measure ourselves objectively. We measure ourselves in comparison to others. Because these emotions are so potent, they get latched onto by politicians and political parties trying to offer inadequate answers to these problems, because that is how the leaders of these parties get elected. And so what you see is, as America descends into this mood of economic regression, you see the political landscape getting increasingly more emotionally charged, where people are coming in and they are now ripping apart the system to try something else, anything else, because they're convinced that anything would be better than this. Now, while I'm not saying that there is nothing better than this and that there is no room for change at all, what we often see is reckless change that is made too soon, without enough analysis and without a proper recognition of these facts. What we see is change that addresses the wrong problem. Because people don't understand the history, people don't understand the reason they feel the way they do, and so they take their negative emotions and they apply those emotions to the wrong problem. And what we see as this happens is a breaking of what is left of the system that allowed America to be so prosperous. As the world progressively rebuilt following World War II, I told you there would inevitably be an American decline. But that decline would be limited. That wouldn't be a crash. It wouldn't be the end of the world for the United States. It would simply be the United States going from being a monopoly, the only player in town, to now being a healthy business with genuine global competition. The risk, though, is overreacting to that decline and creating a different decline that is theoretically unlimited, or at least could be much more serious than the original decline. Globalization in and of itself is not a negative for the United States. It's only a negative because it brings competition where we formerly had none. But as globalization progresses, it can still be a wealth-building endeavor for the United States. Because as the world in general prospers more, we have more trading partners. We have more innovations happening that we can benefit from too. Wealth building is not a zero-sum game, although of course you do make more money as a monopoly than when you have competition. Generally speaking, though, globalization would not be bad for the United States. It just wouldn't be as good as the former thing. But the problem is that in overreacting to this and wanting to grab the prosperity that we once had and bring it back, even though it's never coming back, we can break the system that is allowing us to continue prospering at the level we now prosper today, and we can actually lower our prosperity instead of seeing it rise in the future. Now, do I have much hope for the United States that we can turn this thing around in my lifetime and make our country more prosperous for the people within it? And my answer to that, unfortunately, is currently no. At least at this moment, it seems that most of our country is intent on intentionally misdiagnosing our disease and attacking the wrong problems. Mostly because that is easier to do and it is more politically convenient for people who are trying to get elected with simple solutions to complex problems. And so because of this, I actually see us pushing ourselves currently further in the other direction by attaching blame to anything but the actual source of the problem. No politician ever got elected by saying, hey, things are going to be worse for you than they were for your parents, and that's just how it is. So instead, politicians get elected by pointing the blame in other directions, whether that be other countries, whether that be immigrants, whether that be the other political party, you name it. So that is unfortunate for the nation as a whole, but for individuals, I found that the solution is actually rather simple. It comes back to understanding what our problem really is, and our problem is not that we aren't wealthy. We are objectively still some of the wealthiest people in the world. Our problem is that we compare ourselves up to the other wealthiest people on the planet instead of comparing ourselves down to the people who don't have nearly as much as we do and showing us how content we should really be with our situation. So for the average American, just understanding the nature of our own prosperity can help us a lot. And there's a saying that my grandma used to have above her door in her house that I really like, which is, happiness is not having the things you want. It is wanting the things that you have. And I think for individual Americans, we will be just fine if we start to understand a lot of these things. And perhaps as we are forced to sit in our regression for a while, more Americans will pick up on that. And we will find our happiness in things other than being the strongest nation on earth, the wealthiest nation on earth, and our own personal material prosperity. Always remember that for most of us in the Western world, and especially in the United States, your poverty is somebody else's unimaginable level of wealth and achievement. That carries a lot of weight. And that goes a long way in helping us feel better about our own situations. And hey, you can always go on a hike. That's free. With that in mind, I'm going to close this video. Thanks for watching. And if I could ask for a quick favor before you go, if you enjoyed this, if you got some value out of it, would you consider becoming a patron of the channel? It's completely voluntary. It's just a way for you to support my work if you want to. To learn more, you can scan the QR code on screen or follow the link in the description of this video. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.